Hello and welcome to Badgercam RC. This is part 3 of the Morston semi-scale Norfolk crab boat made by Hughes Aircraft kits. Now, in last week's episode we went round and fitted all of the RC stuff that's got to be added before the boat gets finished. Now, between this episode and the last one, I've gone away and did a couple of little things. What I've done is I've added a tray there in the front. That's for the battery. A little piece of Velcro is going to go under there and up to stop the thing from falling about when it's on the open waves. And I've added these doublers to the front of the ship there to thicken up the sides and make it easier to glue on. And I thought, well, I'd rather them have a good amount of time to glue in between episodes, so I got that done out of the way. Another thing I went off and did was the back hatch to get at the servo. Now, normally when you build this boat, it would get you to put this piece here, this lower piece, inside and use it as a lip to support the hatch. But because of the room in there, I decided to put it all on upside down. I glued the lip to the top and then glued the hatch on top of the lip, and I'm using the lip to screw into the deck. This way it gives me just a little bit more room under there for the servo arm to move around. It's still not a lot, but it's definitely workable. Fortunately, with this episode, we're back on the beaten track and we're not having to do much thinking for ourselves. So we've completed all of this. This is all episode 1. We started doing the RC around this step here, step 12, and now from here on out in this episode we'll be picking things up at step 18 and hopefully working our way through to complete the main build of this boat. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with it, shall we? Now, the first thing it's asking me to do is to fit the upper forward deck. Now, there's two ways of going about this. It doesn't actually tell you where to line the deck up to. One way would be to butt it up against this back piece here. I don't like the idea of that. I think you'd need to put a lip down the front side here for that to work properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue it on flush with the back here. This unfortunately leaves a little bit of space at the front, probably about 1.5 millimeters, and depending on how the side pieces fit to it, I might trim it off, or what I might do is simply fill any gap between the side piece and the front. I get the feeling though, as you can see, that piece is quite big and quite sturdy, so shaving 1 millimeter off of that angle at the front, it's not going to make much difference. So we're going to get on with gluing that in place. This should be fairly simple. It's the next steps of putting the hull on I'm dreading. Anyway, I'll show you that when it's done. A short while later, with no real faff to report, that's the upper forward deck fitted. What I did to do this was put some epoxy, 2-part resin, on the tops of all the surfaces I wanted to glue, push the piece down and held it in place. While it was held in place, simply used a little bit of super glue to give it a purchase while the epoxy resin was setting off. Once I'd done that, I went round and sanded the back forward part of what will be the cabin, just because it will be easier to do it now than to do it later. Anyway, now on to the next bit. Now for the next bit, this is where the pain and suffering is going to start, I think, on this one. I've got to add the 2 lower hull sheets. Now, it's going to be difficult working around the propeller and prop shaft, and I know for a fact that curving everything around this front part here is going to be an absolute bugger. And this is how I've gone about it. This is stage 1 of gluing the lower hull pieces on. What I did is I simply tacked in each corner with a little bit of super glue this end, just to make sure I got the line and I could snap it off. Once I'd run down here and made sure these 2 lines matched and were meeting up in the middle, pulled them back a little bit, ran a big heavy gloopy line of epoxy right the way down the middle, and then wrapped from back to front with the electrical tape, working my way forward. Now, while that's drying, when I get on to the next step, what I'm going to do is, once I've taken that electrical tape off, these side pieces should be liftable by a small amount. All I'm simply going to do is run another bead of epoxy down this edge, and then rewrap it and leave it to dry. Then once that's done, I'm going to move on to this front piece. It's not that difficult on this one by the looks of it, but that's still got quite a bit of tension in it, so it's going to be hard to glue down. I'm simply going to leave something heavy like a cup on the kettle, leave the steam rising out of that, and put this into the steam. This really carefully, if you're going to try doing this at home, it will burn you and it will give you some really nasty burns, and I'm talking from experience there. That should soften the wood up and start making it quite supple. Once it's quite supple, I'll coat the thing in epoxy resin, cocoon the tip here in as much duct tape as I can get my hands on, and then cross my fingers and pray to as many deities as I possibly can it doesn't start to lift while it's drying. Hopefully in the next shot I should be able to show you this with the tape off. Slight change of plan for this bit. I tried using steam off the kettle. Don't think it quite got hot enough. It did work and did make it a little bit more supple, but what I went for instead was to simply leave this area in a small shallow bowl of boiling water for about 20 minutes. This soaked into the wood and then it just went completely limp. It was a hell of a different beast to deal with. Once I'd taken it out of there, dried off the wood as best as I could while still keeping it held in, because as it dries after being steam bent, it tends to keep the position it was left in last. Dried it off a bit. Now what I've done is I've filled all the joins with an absolute ton of epoxy resin, and I've wrapped it in some electrical tape, and now it's simply a case of waiting and hoping. So I'm going to give that a couple of hours now to make sure that stuff's cured properly, and then hopefully take the tape off and we can see what mess I'm left with to fix. So I'll be back in a bit. And after a good couple of hours drying, that's the bottom pieces in place. Done a fairly reasonable job. A couple of little gaps in it, but nothing that the wood filler won't get. Now it's asking me to put the sides on. Now with the side pieces, naturally they're going to go around the sides, but to try and kill a little bit of the bendiness before I start gluing them on, I've been going around and gently just kept reworking these pieces, just going along like that. Gently as well, don't put too much in it. You could snap them if you went over the top. That's why I'm using as much of my hand underneath to support them as I can. And I've just been working away at both of them. I've got them into these quite nice curves, so the plywood they provide you for the sides is actually fairly flexible and quite up to the task really. Now what I'm going to do when it comes to gluing these in is I'm going to try and do what I did before with the lower hull. Glue along the seams and work my way from the back up to the front. So I'm going to get on with that, and if anything interesting happens or anything deviates from that plan, I'll let you know. A short time later, that's the side pieces on. It was a hell of a lot easier than I thought actually. I need to get some more super glue though. What I've been doing, pretty much did exactly what I said I was going to do. Tacked it on with a little bit of super glue at the back, worked my way forward with epoxy, moving in stages. Any bits where I needed a little bit more grab, I put some super glue down and then put the epoxy in afterwards, kind of thing, so that the super glue was just like a brief clamp kind of thing to line it up. Only thing which deviated was right here at the front. That's actually just tape, not the edge, but it comes to a little bit more of a point at the front, and they give you slightly too much wood, so I had to, when I got to here and the two pieces were meeting up, I very carefully trimmed back the pieces with a pair of scissors, as daft as it sounds, and then kept trial fitting them until I thought I had a good fit. And once that's been held in place with once it had been glued together roughly, wouldn't hold, I taped it down with some electrical tape and absolutely drowned the joints and ran a load of epoxy resin down behind the back of this. So in about an hour or so, when that tape comes off, fingers crossed, this will stay where it is. A couple of hours later, That's the front, all dried and holding in position. Now, one last little bit for the outer hulls is the upper side skins, and judging by the dry fit, these are going to be a bit of a faff, but we'll see how we go. I've already pre-bent them just like the other ones, just gently work my way around them. I tell you what, that pre-bending, it saves a lot of stress when it's actually on the boat. Anyway, gonna get on, glue those last side skins on, and a good while later, that's the side skins on. These weren't as good a fit as the other hull pieces. As you can see, there was a bit of gap at the front. I had to put some epoxy in that to fill it up. The main problem with them, however, is, as you can see here, the two pieces didn't quite fit. I think that's probably a little tiny bit of a building error on my half. Now, unfortunately, I did have a little bit of footage. I was trying to get a bit of a footage of them drying, but I'd pressed stop instead of play, so I've just got a random 5 minutes of recording in my room. Now, what I went away and did is, once they were glued in, I've sanded everything back. I've started to sand back all the edges, get a nice flush. There's quite a bit of excess on the top of all of these decks. That's been trimmed back, and now it's been sanded back, or in the process of being sanded back. It's getting a bit late today, as I'm sure you can tell by the lower than low quality on this lighting, and yeah, I'm going to save doing a bit more build for tomorrow. But in the meantime, I think what I might do this evening before I come back to film tomorrow is put a little bit of wood filler in a few of the gaps. There's not that many gaps actually. I was quite impressed with it, other than around the rudder tube, which is my own fault, and the propeller drive shaft, which is my own fault. The kits fit together fairly well. As you can see, I've done a bit of resin sealing around the back end there. It seems like it's going to be a nice boat when it's done. I like this. I like having this top deck and sides on there. Now you can really see the character of the boat coming together. I've got a few plans for this one, mainly due to the nice big working space on the back deck. Possibility of fitting something to that, a little bit special for the videos. But anyway, I'm going to stop rattling on, and I'm going to pick this up tomorrow morning. And this is the following day, all sanded back and wood fillered, ready for sealing. Now, the next thing the instructions is asking me to do is to build the cabin, but then it asks me later on to go back to doing things on the hull. I don't want to do that, as I get the feeling the cabin might be a little bit delicate, and I don't want to risk smashing it up. So the next thing I'm going to do, while the hull is in quite a nice position to be handled and messed around with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and I'm going to put on these spray rails. Fairly simple. The wood's quite supple, so you can pretty much just work your way around and glue them in. The glue is still drying, and as you can see, it's holding to the side of the hull. What I'm going to do is add all the spray rails to the boat. Once they're added, I'm going to get hold of some sanding sealer and seal them all in. Makes sense for me to seal it at this stage and get all the bits which are going to be in the water nice and prepared for that. I'm going to sand and seal all the upper deck stuff as well, but I think it's more important that I get a good couple of coats on this, and I think it will be easier without the cabin installed. So let's get on with doing that. And there's all the spray rails and rubbing rails on. Really loving how it's actually starting to look now. It's got quite a lot of character. At the moment though, it looks like a giant clog. So now with them on, I'm going to go put some sanding sealer down and get this thing ready for the water. Sometime later, that's all the sanding sealer dry. Not much to show, other than the fact that the lighting's got worse. But that's that stage all done. Now to move on to building the cab. Now starting on building the cabin, first step seems fairly simple. Just putting in the rear of the cabin here and the front of the cabin here. Nice and simple, nice and easy. Needs a little bit of sanding to get them to fit. Other than that, no issues. So I'm going to glue them in. For anyone wondering with the windows are the last thing that's going to go in after all the painting's done. So no windows until the end, but they do come with it. So moving on. Next up to fit is these side cabin pieces. Fairly straightforward with all of these. Needs a little bit of a score here to help that bit bend round, as you can see. Wants to go straight out without that. Nothing really complicated about this, but it does need dry fitting before you fit it. As on one of mine, this side is was slightly long, and on this side here it was slightly short, and considering all of this is lined up properly, that would suggest there's maybe a slight deviance in them. So yeah, dry fit them before you fit them, and I'm going to go away and glue them in now. And that's the cabin sides in. Now moving on to the next step, we've got to fit a little support in the back here and these two pieces that will make up the rear of the cabin roof. But there's a little bit of an issue with all of these parts, as if you fit this one normally, it will give you a nice gap at the back here, which we don't want. So you've got to trim a little bit down before it will fit. And same thing again with these cabin roof supports. They're a little bit too long, so they need to be trimmed down. And with all of that back up there flush, there's no room where I've possibly made any errors in this. Anyway, it's not the end of the world, only take a couple of seconds, so I'm going to fit them and show you when they're on. And that's the rear cabin roof fitted. Needed a little bit more trimming before it finally went in. It was about 1 millimetre off the centre areas of both pieces. It's becoming a bit of a theme with the end parts, but it's no sweat really, it only takes a couple of seconds. Now it's asking me to fit the cabin front windows. Now I've already dry fitted these, and just like all the other bits so far, these need some trimming, and they also need a bit of sanding on the edges in order to get them to meet at a point. So I've done all that on them, and I'm going to show you what they look like when they're fitted. With everything towards the end of this kit, it's looking like you're best off dry fitting it before you actually try and glue it in, because there's one of the pieces I just cut off the front cabin windows. It's not really too hard to do or anything like that, so it's no real worry, but it's just something to be aware of, kind of thing. Anyway, let's get on with that. And that's the front cabin windows fitted. I don't know if anyone else can see this, but to me it kind of looks like a knockoff Batman costume with them little pointy ears, and I don't know, maybe it's just me. Anyway, onto the cabin roof. And that's the cabin roof on. This was a bit of a bugger to line up, but didn't actually need to be trimmed. Simply, the thing that made it difficult to line up was the overlap around the edges. I found it was easier to just stick a pin in either side, and that holds it in place while it glues, and then bulldog clips and pegs do the rest of it. Now, just to close off this gap at the front, and we can call it for this episode. And that's the forward cabin roof fitted, and the end, pretty much, of the standard build of this boat. And to be honest with you, I'm actually really happy with it. Sure enough, there's been a few little bits and pieces along the way which could have been done better, but really enjoyed this build, and I can't wait to see some paint on it. Few little problems with the forward cabin roof. Wants to raise up at the corners, but I think I can sort that out with a little bit of super glue and a few pins, and just leave it drying where I want it to stay eventually. I think that's going to call it for this episode. All I'm going to do between this one and the next is have a little bit more of a sand down on the front cabin roof, and apply some wood sealer to it to finish the whole thing off. Anyway, if you're watching this at home and building one yourself, I hope you found the video helpful, and if not, I just hope you found it entertaining. Anyway, until next time, have a good one. Look after yourselves.